find something you love and work longer and harder at it than anybody else. Because when you love what you do, you don't see things in terms of, again, I said it, sacrifices. You see things in terms of benefits, and you enjoy the discipline, you enjoy the subject, you enjoy what other people would call hard work, and I think that makes all the difference.
Kia ora koutou katoa, and welcome to the Kiwi Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Xavier Walker. I'm president of the Kiwi Leadership Network USA. We're a non-profit to help New Zealanders succeed in the US. And in this podcast, we go into some of the stories with New Zealanders in the United States, learning about these amazing peoples and their insights, challenges, and their advices. And today on our episode, we have a phenomenal person, Anthony Mosse, one of New Zealand's greatest swimmers, and he's an honorary consul in San Francisco. We're going to go in depth about his illustrious swimming career as an Olympian, Olympic medalist, Commonwealth Games medalist, and then his transition into business, where he's been leading us for the last 20 years and also now into startups. So Anthony, thank you for taking your time. I know you're a busy person, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Xavier. It is a true privilege and a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for your time.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. So we recently caught up, I think, on the Olympic webinar. We had a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and you shared a little bit about your story and what you're doing. And that was just fantastic. So anybody wants to listen to that, click on our YouTube and have a recap of things. But tell us a little bit about what you're doing and where you're based at the moment.
So I spend my time just south of San Francisco. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, about halfway between the city and Silicon Valley. I've lived here for pretty much 30 years, raised a family here, and I spent many years in finance, which we may talk about a wee bit, and then helped grow an airline called Virgin America, and we did quite well at that, and have now been New Zealand's honorary consul for the San Francisco Bay Area for a number of years. But I also do some work with the New Zealand government looking to attract capital and people to invest in New Zealand. So it's a fun place to be, and it's been a great place to raise a family.
I understand you grew up in Hong Kong, of all places. So can you tell us about that? I understand your father was a pilot for Cathay Pacific.
Yes, indeed. I was born way back in a long time ago now, 1964. And my father indeed was a pilot for Cathay. He and my mum moved there in 1961. I was always a Kiwi, but a bit of an expat brat, I guess, who lived in Hong Kong and had the good opportunity with a parent who lived in Hong Kong and worked in the airline business to commute back to New Zealand quite a bit. So I was back in New Zealand a fair bit. But it was Hong Kong that, I went to primary school. And then when secondary school came along, my parents decided that, no, Hong Kong wasn't the place. You need to go back to New Zealand. So I was sent back to boarding school, and I started the third form at King's in Auckland.
So Hong Kong in the 1960s, so this is takeover. What can you remember any memories about growing up in Hong Kong? What were your early memories? Because I understand you actually, I think the vision we always have is high rises, but you were quite close to the water. Tell us about, your memories of Hong Kong.
Yeah, we lived out in a rural area. We were lucky enough to be able to borrow a boat. We couldn't afford to own one, but we borrowed a boat, used to go out sailing. And I think those are my first memories of swimming. Apparently, one day, my mum and dad were downstairs having lunch, and I was 3 or 4, and I jumped off the boat and started swimming around the boat. And that's where they said, oh, my gosh, what's going on? And so he was this kid who apparently found his love for the water.
That's fascinating. So 3 or 4, did you ever been in the water, or you just suddenly just could swim?
I think they probably put me in with armbands. They weren't completely irresponsible parents, but apparently the story goes I jumped in, and once I was in, it was really hard to get me out. So,
wow! So you loved it,
and I loved it, and we were members of a recreation club, and they used to have swimming lessons, and the swimming lessons would be every half an hour, starting about 2 in the afternoon, so it'd be 2 to 2:30, and 2:30 to 3, and so on, until the most senior group was 4:30 to 5, and I would arrive at the pool in the early part of the afternoon, and I would do the workout of every single person as they led up to my time at 4:30 to 5. So it was just on the outside lane of where they were kind of going through their paces. So I guess I must have really loved it from a pretty early age.
Wow. What age was that?
Oh, probably 8, 9.
Okay. So you kind of just did like not one lesson, you did all of them, did you?
I guess at some point I started doing more, yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome. And so just in reading up, I understand, was Harry Wright was that your first coach in Hong
Right.
Kong? Tell me
Yeah,
about Harry.
exactly. So Harry really was a member of the British military, military Secret Service, and was posted in Hong Kong and decided he loved it so much that he retired from the military and became a full-time professional swimming coach. But when he was coaching me, it was at the local YMCA, and I'd finished up my kind of recreation club, and he said, "Okay, you're a wee bit better than the kids who swim from 4:30 to 5. Why don't you start training with me, and we'll see how well we can go." And so it kind of went from there. So at that time, he was still in the military and kind of part-time swimming coaching. And then as years passed, he decided to focus on training. And we stayed in touch, and it was quite wonderful. He's now sadly passed, but one of the great thrills for me was having him all the way at the Auckland Commonwealth Games in 1990 when I won again, for him to be there. So he looked after a little kid who learned how to swim with him in the very early stages in Hong Kong and followed me all the way through my career. So a wonderful man, and I still miss him.
Oh, wow. What an incredible person. It's a fantastic story. So that's interesting. I mean, because to get up at 4:30 or whatever ungodly time that your swimmers get up, the discipline. So do you think that do you think he planted a few seeds there in terms of the, maybe with special forces and the military things?
What I think he did is he allowed me to go as far as I could with him before I was sent away to boarding school. And of course, boarding school is really designed a little less around swimming, a little bit more around things like rugby and cricket. And so what would happen is I would go to boarding school, and then we used to have it was called the May and the August holidays. I would fly back to Hong Kong, and then I would train with him for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and then go back to New Zealand. And he continued to instill kind of an enthusiasm in me and always stayed in contact and supported me. So I think it was more that enthusiasm than the early morning regime. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure it was. There weren't too many early morning practices when you lived in Hong Kong because getting pool time was very difficult. But nonetheless, it was the exposure to swimming. I made my first international team as a youngster, kind of a high school team for Hong Kong when I was young. I did quite well in the Philippines. And I think it was that first international experience where he said, "You know what, I think you could be pretty good at this thing. Let's stay in touch when you go off to school in Auckland, boarding school, and let's see what happens." So every time I would come home, I'd go and train with them. I'd arrive after not swimming for many months, and I would be terrible. And by the time I left, I'd caught up with everybody again.
I was watching an interview, and it seemed that he had a lot of belief in you. I mean, do you think, we always listen to our parents, but do you think he was one of the first people? I mean, I think the quote was, you were destined to be a gold medalist in the Olympics, and that was quite an early age. Yeah,
I think so. When people say wonderful things about you when you're young, you are impressionable. And I think people also ask me, well, why butterfly? And I think I was just kind of good at it. And people used to say, "Gee, I think you could be really good." They never said that about breaststroke, by the way. So when they said about butterfly, you go, okay, well, somebody thought I was pretty good at it. Maybe let's see how good I can be at it. And it was kind of that early kind of seed, as you kind of suggested, was seed dropped into my mind that, maybe I could be pretty good at something like this.
So you moved to Auckland, going to King's. So boarding school, how old were you with them when you went to boarding school?
So I was, I think, almost 13 when I went to boarding school. And so I spent the first 3 forms, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th form, in a boarding house. And I remember coming home to Hong Kong one day on holiday and saying to my mum and dad, this thing that's called swimming that I'm not able to do because I'm a boarder, I think I could be really good at it if you gave me the chance. And my parents never really forgot that. So they did everything they could in their power to try and find a way for me to swim while I was still in a boarder at school, which meant that, no rules didn't have to be broken, but permission had to be got. And so I remember Bob Faulkner was a wonderful coach at Otahu Swimming Club, which was across the fence from King's. And he would drive me to swimming at Swimmerama, which is another swimming facility in Auckland. And he had a furniture truck. And so I used to ride sometimes because the cab there wasn't enough room for me. I would sit on the top of the furniture trunk where the furniture used to go and drive out to the swimming pool. And then I would train. And then I would get out of swimming, whether it be Swimmerama or the Glen Innes swimming pool back in those days. I'd get out of be in my school uniform, and I'd run up to the takeaway bar and I'd order some hamburger and chips. And then they would put me in the back of the truck again and drive me back to King's and drop me off. I'd go in and do my prep at school. So in the early days, it was really balanced both the academics and the athletics. The Kings were very good because they were letting me do something special. I think they'd also identified that maybe my swimming was something quite special. But they weren't quite willing to give up and let me, become a day pupil. There was all sorts of reasons why they wanted me to stay aboard. But then my mum and dad retired from Hong Kong in 1981, came back to New Zealand. And they said, hey, this thing called swimming that you thought you wanted to give a shot at? If you want to become a day pupil, why don't you become a day pupil lead boarding and see how good you can be with swimming? And I became a day pupil, and I would drive from my my family's place down South Auckland, Papatoe, all the way into Mount Eden in my little VW bug, get up at about 4:30 in the morning. And that was really the first moment where I thought, you know what, this is something I think I want to be really good at. So, my parents never pushed me, they never pulled me, and Kings never really, held me back. They were very supportive of me, but it was difficult to break the boarding life.
So, and you have one brother? Is it Adrian?
I have a younger brother, Adrian, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And so where was Adrian? Was he in Hong Kong, or did he come over as well?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, he kind of came 3 years later and spent 1 year boarding, by which time my parents had retired, and then he became a day pupil as well.
And, he's seems to have been an amazing support for you over the years. You guys are quite close. Did he share the love of swimming with you, or was he just quite supportive and just loved following your progress?
I think he loved it. We went through an interesting period where in Hong Kong we had to swim in a freezing pool for months at a time, and cold was just not his friend. And somehow I stuck it out, and I think that kind of made a large difference. He was very successful, but he just decided that he wanted to do other things. I think it's got to be really difficult when you've got a sibling who is kind of high profile and successful to find a way to contribute, but he just naturally did it.
Oh, that's fantastic! Yeah. I did read when I was reading the scoreboard thing, and he used to make you tapes as well. I'm really interested about these tapes. What were was this audio tapes or or video tapes? What would he do? What was it?
They were audio tapes, and a lot of them were just my favorite music.
Okay.
Yeah, and there would be a little bit of banter in the beginning about how he was giving me a hard time about being a slacker or something, and then it was music. And you might remember back in those days we had Walkmans.
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
The Walkmans was the way that the athletes and swimmers and others would walk down to their races listening to this music. And so I would listen to the tapes that he would make me, and they would get me kind of pumped up for the races.
Oh, you mentioned though, that it was you were still at school when you started competing for New Zealand. So this is about 16, 17, is that right?
Yep, 1981, exactly. 16, 17, yep.
Okay. Yep. And then I understand you had some issues. Probably one of your biggest assets, but also one of your issues over your feet. So just tell us about your feet, which have caused you a bit of trouble, but obviously giving you a lot of power with the fly. Just tell us about that, and then also I understand you broke your ankle before the Commonwealth Games, which is.
Truth be told, I'm not very good on land. So,
well, you're very good in water.
I'm much better in water, but on land I'm a bit clumsy. So, yes, to your question, 1982, before the Commonwealth Games, maybe 3.5 months-ish before, I tried to kick a rugby ball, and I kicked the ground instead and, made a complete mess, broke my ankle. But then I went to swimming training for the New Zealand national team down in Hamilton at Te Rapa, and I trained with a cast on. So the doctor put on a special waterproof cast. And after every training session, I would drag this boot, this literal cast through the water, which obviously was good for my upper body strength. And then I'd go back to the dorm rooms where we were staying. I think it was the teachers' college we were staying at as a national team. And I'd take a blow dryer and I would go up and down my foot, blow drying, trying to get it dry. And of course, nonetheless, when it came out of this cast, it looked disgusting. The skin was green and it was horrible. But it kept the cardio working. And it was just another way to stay motivated. And they had time trials at the end of that kind of Commonwealth Games, swimming camp, if you will. And they gave me some silly time to try and beat 100 butterfly, dragging this cast behind me. I couldn't dive in. I just have to push off with one leg, but I did it. So those are the kind of mental challenges that make a difference. And if you fast forward all the way to 1990, I'm at high altitude training at the U.S. Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. And I fell down a wheelchair access ramp that ironically should have made it nice and smooth to come into the dorm room there, and twisted my ankle again. it wasn't as bad as it was back in 1981. So yes, from the beginning to the end, these wonky ankles have been with me.
I'm not a swimmer. I love swimming, but I'm not a very good swimmer. But it seems like if you are, got some different body parts that are longer or bigger, it does make a difference. And I was quite fascinated. Many of the people you swam across were called different birds. So the albatross and then the California condor. So and then we think about Michael Phelps as just really enormous, really. So is there a natural physique for a swimmer or a flyer? I mean, in terms of you're taller than me, but some of these. What was reading about one of them that was 6'7" or something?
Yeah, they're very big athletes these days. I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, there isn't one particular body type. Of course, you've got sprinters and then you've got distance. I think for butterfly, flexibility is very important. I think for butterfly, a very strong kick. So strong kick, flexible ankles and hip work are really, really important. But as somebody told me the other day when we were talking about the Olympics and the Olympians in 2021 in Tokyo, I mean, these swimmers now are true athletes. We were just swimmers back in those days. I mean, these are true athletes who can, they've got tremendous vertical jumps. I mean, my vertical jump was tiny, right? But, the athletes, particularly explosive athletes in the shorter distance today, these guys are absolutely massive. But back in our day, we tried to be long and lithe and flexible and not carry too much muscle. I think it would be different had I been more of a 100 butterfly specialist than a 200. I mean, think about running on the tracks. Think about the body type of a 200 or maybe a 400 runner versus someone who's an 800 or a 1500. It's slightly different body types, right? So it's kind of horses for courses.
That's great. So coming out of school, you have, you've got Commonwealth Games and then World Universities in Edmonton, I understand, and you were one of the first New Zealanders to win a medal at there. Can you tell us about those first, kind of big competitions before the 84 Olympics? So tell us about, first time, being on representing New Zealand at the Commonwealths and the World Universities. How were the student games? How was those experiences?
So the 82 Commonwealths were after my broken ankle, and I finaled, and I think I swam my best time, and I did pretty well, and I was happy, but I always knew there was something more. But 1983 was really kind of the game changer for me. So I won the first medal that New Zealand ever won at a World Students or World University Games, and it was a bronze in the 200 butterfly. But what was really cool is the gold medalist was the then defending Olympic champion Sergei Fosenko, who'd won gold in Moscow in 1980. And the silver medalist at the University Games was Phil Hubble, who was then the defending Commonwealth champion in 1982 Commonwealth Games in Brisbane. So here's the little old Kiwi behind the Olympic champion and the Commonwealth champion. I took third. And I raced a great race. I got very close. And I thought, what? I can do this. And that was a big moment for me. It was really great for the Kiwi team. It was really great for me, but that was okay, this is something I can do. And, there's no reason why I can't be the best in the world at it. So 81, 82, 83 were massive learning curves for me. And also, I've arrived and I think I can do very well.
Oh, yeah. I can imagine, I suppose if you're competing, you always want to kind of win, but you realize, these guys are pretty good. But then was that the first time you sort of like, okay, I can do this, going to race, I know I can compete with the best in the world?
Yes, when I think of, 81, I had pre-Commonwealth Games, 82 was Commonwealth Games, 83 was really the first true international sport. I mean, I was racing against, back then it was the Eastern Bloc, right? And so we had people from Africa and Asia and Europe and as I said, the Eastern Bloc. So you'd be warming up and you'd be training next to swimmers who names I had only read about in Swimming World magazines. And so that was the first time of, wow, this is really, this is the best the world has to offer.
Wow. 84 Olympics. Tell us about that. The first Olympics building up and your experiences.
Yeah. So 84, I quietly thought, I've got a shot at a medal here. I mean, I never counted myself out. I knew I was good enough to final in both the 100 and 200 butterfly. But I thought, good day. Let's see if we can win a medal. And of course, one of the very definitions of that is John Stephen, the wonderful Australian who won from out of nowhere to win the Olympic gold in the 200 butterfly, break the world record and beat Mikkel Gross, who was the then world record holder in the 200 butterfly. So one of the most extraordinary races. When I look back and I think about some of the races that I've been in, the Olympic 200 meter butterfly, if you look back and you read about it, was arguably it was the finest field in this discipline that the world had ever seen. And I was fortunate to get fifth in it. So I came close to a medal, but didn't get one. In the 100 butterfly, I'd never fancied myself as much as a 100 as a 200 butterfly, but I got sixth in that. So all of a sudden, this Kiwi kid before going off to uni, fifth and sixth double Olympic finalist. And what was really cool is I had already been recruited by a number of universities. And when I went into those LA Olympics in the summer, the northern summer of 1984, I'd already accepted to go to Stanford. So Pablo Morales, who was one of the great Olympic swimmers of the time, and John Moffat as well, who had tragedy because he tore a groin and didn't win a medal, but was one of the odds-on chances in Los Angeles in '84. These guys were going to become my friends. So it was really neat to know that I was going to be able to contribute because I'd done well at the Olympics. So, those first Olympics were always a little bit overwhelming, but it was never only going to be just about those. They were going to be a stepping stone to something else. And I got to look forward to, what was going to be another 4-ish years at an American university that knew how to swim.
It seems a few of you from that team went over to America. Were the Americans keeping an eye on New Zealand talent, or how did that all come about?
I don't know how, I know that Paul Kingsman and Anna Simsek, for example, went to Cal, and later Danyan went to Cal for a little while. I think we all kind of went our own separate ways, and I think we're all slightly different timing-wise. But I had been interested in going to school in the US. I got to a point in New Zealand where I felt like I was a big fish in a little pond, and the American college program is absolutely phenomenal. I think it's one of, if not the best pre-Olympic training programs there is anywhere. And so for me, it was a case of, I knew my academics were always going to be very important to me, but I also wanted my athletics. And so I was a believer surprised to my parents. So I thought that when I finished high school, I was going to go off to Auckland Uni and stick around. And I said, I think I want to do something more. So I ended up in conversations with a number of universities. And I decided to go to Stanford. They hadn't won the national championship in many years. But I'm a firm believer that to be the best in something, you've got to do two things. You've either got to compete with the best, or you've got to train with the best.
Was there any insight? I'm just interested in your pick on Stanford. That campus is phenomenal. I think my wife actually had a recruit. She was quite for basketball. She ended up going to Harvard, but she did Stanford. Just going through that campus is phenomenal. Was there also, looking back in terms of, you obviously did a lot very well academically as well. Did you kind of see those opportunities and that, I can do really well here swimming and contribute, but, I might make a pivot later on. Was there any thought process when you were picking schools?
Yes, there was. Although I've got to tell you, UCLA and Cal are incredible institutions as well. So it's, it's the, you get the pick of the pick. And I was just very fortunate that Stanford worked out for me. But, the bigger picture was my academics were always going to be important to me. I always realized that at some point the body wasn't going to take me to the next level, and whatever I'd studied was going to. So the academics were important, and I'm fortunate that Stanford is a very good school. It's got a great academic reputation. I'm also incredibly fortunate that they offered me a full ride scholarship. My family couldn't have afforded to send me there. And so it was literally a life-changing decision to go there. Cal and UCLA, I think, would have come up with the same type of package. But Stanford offered me a full ride. It was great. And of course, swimming-wise, we were national champs 3 of the 4 years I was there. And I was team captain, and I was the individual champion in the 200 butterfly in my senior year. So it worked out athletically and it worked out academically. I was very lucky.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you studied politics and economics at undergrad?
Yeah, political science and economics undergrad, exactly.
Oh, that's fantastic. And then, so during this period, there's world champs, another Commonwealth Games. Tell us a bit about that, and another university games. You must have been a busy person flying all around the world and balancing things.
Well, I was very lucky, and that's another benefit, I guess, if you go to university in the Northern Hemisphere, is the Northern Hemisphere summer is typically when the events are, which makes it more difficult also if you're a Kiwi, right? Because you don't get that long break like you do where you can afford to travel. You've got to break work, or you've got to break your academics in order to go overseas, to go to university games, to go to Commonwealth Games, to go to the Olympics, whatever. But the US system is built because it's Northern Hemisphere that allows you to do that. And so I would race for most of the northern summer and then come back home to New Zealand for 2 or 3 weeks, take a holiday, and then go back to Stanford. So that was generally the cycle that happened. But yes, in 1985, I won the Pan-Pacific Games for the Toronto Butterfly. I'm the first Kiwi to win a gold in that, which is pretty cool. And then we had the World University Games in Kobe, Japan, and that was my first taste of Michael Gross, the albatross. He won the Toronto Butterfly. I got second to him at those games. So I was doing well, and I was still improving. And then 1986 was really kind of my big breakout year. I won the Commonwealth Games at a time, I think that was the second fastest time in history, in a kind of a beat up, not very fancy swimming pool in Edinburgh, Scotland, that I have very fond memories of. As a matter of fact, when you dived in, it was so shallow that you kicked the bottom. It's not the very deep pools now, and they're built deep, so there's no waves that bounce back at you to kind of distort your movement through the water. So from that perspective, it was an old pool, and I did an incredible time. So I won gold in the Toronto Butterfly, got a silver in the 100. You look back and you think, well, what are the top 10, 15 moments in my life? And I've got to put that up there along with, kids and all that other stuff that just, you wake up the next day and you go, oh my gosh, I actually did this. And I went really fast. So that was the 86 Commonwealths. And then I continued through to Madrid at the 86 World Champs, where I won a silver. And that was equal best. Gary Hurring, a wonderful backstroker for New Zealand, had also won a silver at the 1978 World Champs in the 200 backstroke. So I did the same as he did in the 1986 World Champs. And I took second to Michael Gross again. So Gross and I knew each other just a wee bit, 85, 86. But that was really when I thought, you know what, this is pretty cool. It was that next level of, okay, how good can we be? And also a change in my training pattern happened in 1986. A very good friend of mine, Sean Murphy, a Canadian backstroke champion, and I were rooming together. And he said, well, rather than go back to New Zealand for the summer, why don't you come and train with me? And so I went and trained with him. And we spent a bunch of time in high altitude training in Salt Lake City. And I spent a bunch of time in Toronto, Canada, which is where he's from and where his club's from. And I spent 6 weeks with his team, kind of getting ready for the Commonwealth Games and getting ready for the World Champs. And in those 6 weeks, I ended up winning the Commonwealth Gold in Edinburgh and took silver at the World Champs. And this is a precursor to when we start talking about the Olympics and my preparation for the Olympics in 1988. But 86 was, I think I need to stay overseas and not come home. And it was a very difficult decision, but also it seemed to be the right one for swimming, that I didn't come back to New Zealand. I had a phenomenal coach, Musashi Inamata, who coached in Mount Eden and had brought me through the ranks when I first started swimming, and I got my driver's license, became a day pupil. And I would drive all the way into Mount Eden and swim with him. So he was looking after me all those years. And then in 86, I thought, well, I don't want to come back to New Zealand, get sick, and go back through the New Zealand winter. It was the first time I really kind of ventured out and thought, I need to stay in the northern summer, and I will go and swim with the Canadians for a few weeks. And
tell us about the experience of getting, the gold in Edinburgh. What was that like? What was the feelings, and just, it was kind of like a lifetime of work, and then suddenly, hey, I've really made it.
Absolute, utter jubilation. I could have walked. I could have walked on water. Was the feeling? It was so absolutely extraordinary. And you work hours and hours, and you swim thousands of meters, and you're lucky if you get those kind of moments in your life. I figured out that I swam something like 3,000 kilometers a year. So that's not running, that's not biking, that's with a Speedo suit going up and down a pool. And so you want to make the most of those times. And I look back at my swimming career, and you can either choose the Olympics or the Commonwealths, whichever one you want, but you get those every 4 years. And it's very different than, you're a golfer and you're going to hit that extra swing, and you've swung, for the ball 1,000 times a day for years, or tennis or whatever, and you've got multiple opens a year in both of those sports. Well, in swimming, you've got one Commonwealths every 4 years, and you've got one Olympics every 4 years. So instead of having 16 events, if I choose 4 majors in golf a year, over 4 years, that's 16. I have one Olympic cycle in 4 years, or I have one Commonwealth cycle. And so you really got to make the most of it. And so every once in a while, you get it right. And it worked out. I got it right. But I didn't just kind of get it right. I got really right because I swam so incredibly fast. I just couldn't believe it.
How do you think you did that in terms of putting it all together, handling that pressure, timing, not getting sick? You did get injured, but you kept on going, reading through that. But what sort of things do you think allowed you to do that, to pull out the performance? I mean, your handling of the pressure.
I mean, I absolutely love to compete. I mean, if you talk to anybody that trained with me, I wouldn't give a centimeter, I wouldn't give a millimeter every single practice, every repeat. I just love to race. And so that just translated nicely into competition. And I used to make the most of the times where, you'd be in your swim togs and you got your goggles and your cap, and you walk out onto the pool deck and you'd come from the ready room and someone might have lost their lunch because of nerves. People are chanting and doing all sorts of silly preparation things. Not silly, but, in their own mind. But in my mind, it's just kind of, okay, it is what it is. Let's go out there and have some fun. And so I just tried to keep it simple. And I would sit there on the chairs and look around and say, the moments kind of don't get any better than this. And so I just fundamentally enjoyed the competitive moments because I was competing every single day and getting ready for that moment. So it was just like, okay, I've been here before, let's do it again. And it was just a soft pride. I think people knew that I was very mentally tough and that it was time to race. I wasn't going to give anybody anything. And I also studied a lot. I was very careful with respect to how I looked at my competitors. I studied them. I knew the strategy. I knew the tactics. I knew the backgrounds. I had diaries that I would write in every single practice, every single workout. And I wouldn't write just that I did, 10 400s and 2 200s and 350s and a couple of swims in. And I'd go home and I'd write how I felt about every one of those sets. So I have this objective and this subjective feedback. And I've just got countless diaries. And as a matter of fact, before chatting with you, I thought, I wonder if I can see them, if I can find them. And I found a couple of them. And it was quite remarkable back then that I was getting ready for the big time. I was getting ready for the races because to me, that's what it was always about, was the big time races.
That's interesting, the level of detail and preparation. And the subjective is really important. I imagine a lot of people overtrain. They kind of almost get this overtraining syndrome. And so were you able to kind of know when to go hard, when to back off and kind of time things a bit better?
Boy, that's an excellent question. And Anthony today would tell you I'd learned that probably too late. And I swam because I loved it. But I found myself in a coaching situation in 1988 where I had a coach who said, look, I don't want you to think about anything. All I want you to do is I want you to be at one wall at one time. So we've got four laps in the 200 butterfly, right? The 50, the 1, the 150, and the 200. I want you to be at the 50 at a certain time, the 100 at a certain time, the 150 at a certain time, and the 200 at a certain time. That's all you need to do. Nothing else. Just get there on the times that I tell you, and that's it. And it took away the creativity, and it took away the enjoyment, and it took away the focus and the attention to detail, and I just became a little bit of a robot. And that took away the enjoyment. And that's where I think you've got to understand your own body, and you've got to some extent, give it up to a coach, a teacher, a mentor, but really, they're not the ones in the ring. They're the ones standing outside the ring. And so there has to be some ownership. So fully giving it up to somebody else is something that I would never do again. And so when I approached the Commonwealth in 1990, Hilton Brown was phenomenal. He was our national swim coach at the time. He kind of let me do a lot of what I wanted to do while supporting me. So I went from an overbearing situation in the 88 Olympics to really having much more control over how I wanted to do what I wanted to do in 1990, and that worked out a lot better. So that's an excellent question. And if I was talking to athletes today, I'd say just be very wary of giving everything up to a coach who thinks they know everything when they don't. Skip Kenny, the swim coach at Stanford when I was there, was extraordinarily good at working us for everything but the last 3 weeks of the year, because he worked us really hard. He thrashed us in the pool and in the gym, and we'd go for runs and all this sort of stuff, and he was very disciplined. For the last 3 weeks, he was like, you know what, you are student athletes, most of you. You are smart and you're mature, you're adults, and the taper time of what you need is kind of up to you. So he kind of let us do what we wanted to do. And that was what I was more used to. So there's a fine line there. But I err in the last moments of an athlete's preparation before major competitions to to trust themselves and take ownership, because at the end of the day, they're the ones in the ring.
We've kind of been talking around that. Let's get to Seoul. So, you're now one of the world's best, have been for a couple of years, and 88 Seoul, one of the big Olympics, wasn't it? So just tell us about that. And then you obviously had some major family things. Can you just tell us about that really tough period in your life? And, well, obviously big and tough.
So 88 started out well. I became NCAA champion in the 200 butterfly, which I'd wanted to win for many years, and was second, I think, 3 times to Pablo Morales, arguably the greatest U.S. collegiate swimmer in history. And so it was my turn to win. And so I did. And so I kind of entered the summer of 1988 feeling pretty good about things. And so I did the same thing in 88 as I'd done in 86, except in 86, I trained with this particular coach for 6 weeks. Well, my good mate, Sean Murphy, the Canadian backstroke champion, said, why don't you come and train with me? So we stopped out at Stanford for basically 6 months. So we finished after the NCAA swimming champs, and we took no more school. And then we flew to Canada, and I lived in Toronto, Canada for months at a time. And I trained really, really hard. I lost a lot of weight and worked really hard, did a ton of miles. And the idea was to understand that when I stood on the blocks of the Olympic final, I looked across, there was nobody who could have worked any harder than me. I mean, that was the philosophy, along with a coach who said, you don't need to think too much about it. Just be at one wall at one time and one wall at another, backwards and forwards. And if you do the time that I set, you'll be the Olympic champion. And he had taken me to be the Commonwealth champion 2 years beforehand. And also the World Championship silver medalist 2 years beforehand. So, it made a ton of sense. And so we were training and traveling, getting ready for pre-Olympic meets. We'd done a meet in Los Angeles, and I called home. And so I'm thinking now, the Seoul Olympics were in September, so this would have been May, June. And I called home the old days in a payphone and said, "Hey, Mum, what's going on? How are you doing?" She said, "I've been trying to catch you for a couple of days. Dad's not well. I think you need to come home." And so true to form, my coach at the time said, "Okay, you can go home, but you need to race the 200 butterfly first in this particular meet in Los Angeles." So like a pre-Olympic meet. So I dutifully swam, and I won the 200 butterfly, and I got on an airplane and flew back to New Zealand. So I spent a week traveling between my home and the hospital and the swimming pool. And this was, middle of winter, and Dad was not well. And one day, after going around that kind of triangle for a while, Mum and my mum's doctor and I sat down and said, what's going on? And we didn't know if Dad would last 3 weeks or 3 months. And so my family and I made the decision that I would go back to the Olympics, in Olympic preparation, and see what I could do. So I flew back to Toronto, Canada. And a week later, my dad passed away, which was really hard, really, really hard. And, he'd been part of the whole family unit and extremely supportive. And then was that really tough question, do I come home or do I stay? Because we were now a matter of like 6 weeks away from the Olympics. And should I come back to New Zealand? And my family said, no, you stay. You stay and you see this happen and do the best you can. And so that's what happened. And so Dad's passing was really difficult. And I was in Canada for maybe another week to 10 days. And then I flew to high altitude training in Salt Lake City. And I went there because the Canadian team were going there as well, along with the Canadian coach who was coaching me. However, unbeknownst to me, on the way to Salt Lake, the Canadian team had decided that I would not be allowed to train with them because there was a Canadian butterfly who was a great rival of mine who was going to the Olympics as well, and they didn't want me to benefit from training with them. So my coach said, "I'm sorry, but you can't train with me." So here I am in a beautiful lodge called Snowbird in Salt Lake City, Utah, a wonderful ski resort in the summertime. And I was going to stay with the Canadian team in the lodge. And so they basically booted me out. And so I had to find another place to stay. So I went to the ski instructor's lodge, and I stayed in a dormitory that had about 15 beds. And of course, this is being summer. There's nobody there, just me. And so I would make, I'd make my hot cereal in the morning out of the tap and all these empty beds. And I'd rented a car, and I would quietly see this coach as I was driving down the mountain, because the lodge, the ski instructor's dorm and the lodge were maybe a mile and a half apart, a couple of K apart. And I'd drive down, stop off at the lodge, get the swimming program written by the coach, Mind you, I was never an athlete who liked to see the workout beforehand. I like to give 100% to every single thing. Now here I had to see the program. I'd drive down the mountain. I'd go to the swimming pool. I'd take the cover off just for a lane. And then I would train by myself because I wasn't allowed to train with the Canadians. And then the Canadians would come down the mountain and I'd get out of the pool and I'd drive back up to the ski instructor's dorm and stay there and rest until I do the same thing in the afternoon. And so that happened for a couple of weeks. And that was really hard. I mean, I had nobody. I wasn't allowed to go and hang with the Canadians, and I had no coach. And so that was a really, really tough time. But, one of these things, you do the best you can. And I'm a fond person of saying, I have a fond saying, reasons to succeed, not excuses to fail. And so I thought, this is going to be fine. I'm going to be able to manage it. So then I went to Seoul, Korea. I flew from Salt Lake City. I think I went through Seattle maybe or LA, and then went on to Seoul, and then the Olympics happened. And so I was the 100 and 200 meter butterfly. And I had finished sixth in the Los Angeles Olympics 4 years earlier in the 100 butterfly, not being a 100 specialist, but thought, maybe I can do okay on a good day. Maybe I can sniff at a medal. Well, I didn't make the final. And I made the B final. And an Olympic swimming complex like Seoul has a major, the international racing pool is where all the stadium seats are and where all the TV cameras look down. Well, underneath those is another 50-meter pool, which is the warm-up pool. Or the cool down pool. And I had a cool down after the 100 butterfly, looking at the results, realizing that I hadn't made the final. I remember swimming up and down the cool down warm up pool, and I saw my Canadian coach, and I swam over to him and I sat on the side of the pool deck, my goggles, I lifted them up and I said, and he said, so how do you feel? How did that feel? And I said, I just don't feel like I'm rested enough. And he had a program in his hand. He had a program in his hand, and he hit me on the side of the head with my program in front of all my peers. And he said, take care of yourself, big guy. And he left. And he walked away. And so I'm thinking, okay, reasons to succeed and not excuses to fail. We can do this. So I waited for the end of that swimming session. And I tried to talk to him, but he didn't have any interest in talking to me. And as it had transpired, he'd taken, I think, 7 Olympic athletes to those Olympics, myself and 6 Canadians. And one of the Canadians had actually been the world record holder in her event going into Seoul. And none of them won a medal except me. But I hadn't won my medal yet. And so now this coach said, I think he'd just kind of blown a gasket and decided he couldn't handle it. So then you fast forward to the 200 butterfly. So I have no dad and I have no coach. And it was in the interim 2 or 3 days where I reached back to Skip Kenny, who was one of the head coaches of the U.S. team, my Stanford coach, to keep an eye on me, and also reached out to Hilton Brown, who was wonderful, who kept an eye on me as well. So these guys would time me for warm-ups and just kind of keep an eye on me and try and give hand. Although neither one of them were kind of responsible for me being there, but they kind of helped me out. And so now you go to the Olympic final. I gave it my best. I missed out on a silver medal by 400ths of a second. And just to give you that in distance, 400ths is not even the distance that your fingernail will grow in a day. And so it's not the width and it's not the length, it's the depth of a piece of paper. And so when you go 200 meters and you miss out on a medal by that, it's not easy. So that was my build up and my preparation and the results of the Olympics. I still went there with the very best of attitudes. I remember walking out onto the deck for the final, the 200 butterfly, and thinking about my dad and thinking about New Zealand. And I remember I would always look for the New Zealand flag at the venue, wherever I raced. And because you warm up sometimes in the major competition pool, I knew where the Kiwi flag was down the far right-hand side. And so when the starters would say, gentlemen, get ready, they blow a whistle and you got to get your gear off and you put your goggles and your cap and your togs and you look down, and I would always just look at the Kiwi flag just to nod, okay, we're in this together, let's go for it. Because pride in my country was massive, and it's kind of what got me through. And my pride in my faith. But in this case, it was, I looked and I saw the flag, and the last thing, that was the second last thing I would do. The last thing was the silver fern, and just the way the swimwear manufacturers had, the silver fern was right down on the groin of your swimsuit. And so you could see it as you bent down to race. It was kind of like, okay, there's the groin and there's the silver fern. So you look at the flag and you look at the fern and you're off. So I try to take everything and just put it inside, wrap it up in my country and do the best of my country. And so it wasn't the right medal in my mind. But as I've gotten older now and I look back, it's a blessing. When I got home from the Olympics, I didn't want to see the medal. I put it in a drawer. I think I even sent it out to people who used it to raise money in lotteries and stuff like that. And I think it got the odd nick and scratch as people dropped it. And it was really hard for many years to come to terms with it. But then my mom said once, she said that medal didn't ask to be bronze. Just like your kids have challenges, they don't ask for these challenges, but you love them nonetheless. And so it's been a wonderful learning and understanding experience of a journey where I look back now and I think, well, it wasn't the color that it should have been, but nonetheless, it was the right color. And it kept me motivated to do other things, including, going on to the Commonwealth 2 years later. So, it's a long and in-depth answer to your question, but nonetheless, I think it's important for that piece of the story to be told that way because it was brutally difficult, but reasons to succeed are not an excuse to fail, where you look back and say, it wasn't exactly what I wanted, but at the end of the day, it was pretty jolly good.
Anthony, you got to give us that's just incredible story. And as a New Zealander listening to this, thank you for all the work you've done for that. I mean, that's just all that, I think this is why we tell the stories. I mean, to hear that hardship that you went through with the family, I can't even imagine, just being somewhere where you don't know anybody and you've got to train by yourself and in dealing with that, and then the coach. But as you say, these are the life lessons. And for you to be top 3 in the world, I have to kind of say, watching that race, you went for it. You didn't leave. I mean, when I watched the pace, I mean, I don't know swim times that well, but it looked like he had Gross he set a pretty phenomenal front pace race, and you went for him. You're like, okay, I'm going to go with it, and maybe just tied out a little bit at the end, but you couldn't. I think you gave it everything. I mean, it was just a phenomenal race. I mean, I'm top 3 is pretty amazing for me in the world, but for all of us. But I just think when I look at that, you really gave everything, and that was an exciting race to watch. I don't know. Do you see it, like, looking back on it, a little different, or is it still a bit hard to watch? Or
it's still hard to watch. It's all relative. I like to say it's not where you finish compared to others. It's where you finish compared to you. My compared to me was to be an Olympic champion. But as I've gotten older, and as I meet more people in the world, and it's not something I wear on my sleeve and tell everybody about. When people find out about it, they think it's pretty cool. And I look back and I go, yeah, well, it was pretty cool. But to your point about the race, I really felt my back was against the wall. I had nothing to lose, and I was going to give absolutely everything I had and see what happens. And, it was very nearly a silver. I'd never beaten Gross, so had I not beaten Gross again, I guess you could say, well, you never did, and maybe you never would have. But I got close on a couple of occasions, and my times in '86 were extremely close to his, so there's no reason why I shouldn't have. But the gold, silver, and bronze in Seoul in '88 were the same 3 who won the medals at the World Champs in 1986. It was just that Benny Nielsen from Denmark stepped into the silver at the Olympics, where I had the silver at the Worlds, and we flipped it. But that's also, that's what the Olympics is all about. It's very different to a Worlds or a Commonwealth. But yeah, you give everything you possibly got. You try and get to the wall as quickly as you can, no matter how hard it hurts. Because, that's what you spend, all those years and years and years doing. And for it to come down to in my case, 400th of a second, that's the way it goes.
Where do you keep your medal now?
So when I turned 40, more than a couple of years ago, and my wife said, it's time we put this thing out. So
absolutely,
I have a medal cabinet that has Olympic, Commonwealth, and Worlds, and Pan Pacs, and NCAAs, and US Opens, and all those kind of wonderful medals. And I don't feel so bad about giving you a list of them now, because I'm old enough that it's it's long enough ago that hopefully it shouldn't feel like I'm bragging about it. But it's kind of nice to go in there every once in a while, look at them and go, holy schmoly, that was me.
Yeah. No, good for you,
Yeah.
Anthony. I think that's important. I mean, Rod carries this around in his pocket. It kind of freaks people out when he speaks. He's like, well, talks about it, and then he kind of ding, and he's like, here it is, and puts it around, and he's
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think Lorraine does this. Yeah,
but it should be. These things should be inspirations for people, right?
Absolutely. People almost cry when they touch them. I mean, it's amazing. What we had a conference with Rod, and when we handing that around, that the power of that, and it is that blood, sweat, and tears. Everything gone into it. It's the history. It is, you say it, but when you see it, was some touching one of those medals. It is a special moment for everybody.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's awesome.
You know what? I would feel the same way if Lorraine took out her medal or Rod took out his, because I remember those. Lorraine and I were more contemporary. She actually won her medal, I think, in '92 after I won mine in '88. So she was afterwards. But she also preceded me with some incredible successes. And Rod definitely, I can say this, Rod definitely preceded me. But seeing those people do what they did was motivation, right? Especially, the Rods and the John Walkers of the world. They're like, okay, I want to be like them.
That's cool.
And so if you can be an inspiration for others, tremendous. Yeah.
So just after that, you were acknowledged by the Queen, MBE. Tell us about that. Yeah. That must have been an amazing experience to get recognized for your efforts.
Yeah, that was out of the blue and overwhelming. And I don't know what to say. I go and look at that. I look at this beautiful medallion that I was given, and I think, holy schmoly, that was me. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of, as I get older, I think.
So that was in Wellington. That was you go to Wellington, and it was Sir Paul Reeves. Was he Governor General?
Yep, Governor General. Great memory. Yes, 1989. Went down there with my mom and brother, and got all dressed up. And I'd have to say that and carrying the flag at the Auckland Commonwealth Games, being selected as the team flag bearer, were two of the most extraordinary moments of my life, where I had a lot to do with a lot of things, but sometimes you don't have as much to do with other things, and people surprise you. So the MBE and the flag were the two things that I went, oh my gosh, how did that be me? How was that ever me?
And that must have been really nice being there with your mother and your brother, just very meaningful,
Yeah, I think so. I mean, my mom's a royalist, and so she loved, and for her son to be, awarded an MBE, I think was a super proud moment for her. And, she sat and she used to joke that she would prop up pool walls all over the world, where she'd sit and lean against pool walls and watch people race, go up and down. And every once in a while, her son Anthony and her son Adrian would get in the pool and race. But most of the time it was looking at other kids racing. So for her to be part of that, which she very much was, I think was a proud moment for her.
So Auckland, kind of a little different. So tell us about that home crowd, flag bearer. Tell us about that and about how and things were a bit different sponsorship wise. Like, I understand you had a bit more support, rightly so. Just tell us about that preparation and the Auckland Games.
So Auckland 1990 I was very fortunate again. I mean, the '88 Olympics, I could have hung my togs up then and be done with it. But Auckland 1990 happened to be in my hometown. It happened to be the first time that a major international sporting event was going to be held in New Zealand, in my home country. And it was going to be in January, February. It wasn't going to be in July or August later in the year. So it was really only kind of 18 months, 17, 18 months after the Olympics. And I was suffering from a very bad back. I'd injured my back in 1987, and it had impacted my racing and so forth. And so my back was troubling me all the way through. And I thought, gee, can I last that long? But I decided to go after it again. And lived at home and started training and trained with Hilton Brown. And, I think we both had a ton of fun. We worked really hard, and we had a really intense, probably, 9 months there. We had to kind of beg, steal, and borrow pool time, which is what one needs to do still, because there are not a lot of training pools literally in the country, but certainly in a city as large as Auckland. And so we're moving around a wee bit and training in different pools. But that went really well. I mean, it was really the culmination of everything I'd learnt at Olympics and Commonwealths of Worlds at Stanford and traveling on my own. I used to joke that when I would travel, I was the administrator and the coach and the physio and the psych because I did everything. I stood there and I entered myself in meets, and I took care of myself and I'd feed myself. And so all those things over the years are kind of as a lone Kiwi traveling overseas, you bring it all back. And now you've got this incredible support network that was, the New Zealand Olympic Commonwealth Games Association. And then to your question, I had sponsors between Marley, which was, and still is, I think, kind of a rainwater, spout and guttering company. And, I had the ASB Bank, and I did things for Watties, and I had speaking engagements. And so those were very special moments because it was my hometown. But it was really tough, I have to tell you, Xavier, with respect to making sure that I focused on swimming, and I didn't get sidetracked because, people knew who I was, and they understood my name. And if they didn't recognize my face, if I signed my name on, a credit card statement or whatever, they're like, "Oh, you're you," and they'd all want to have a chat, and people would invite you out, and they were super friendly. But that was one of the hardest things, was to simply stay focused and do the hard yards in the pool and in the gym while other people were calling for your time. So that was the only challenge. Whereas, for example, if you had the Olympics in a different country or the Commonwealth, you went there, and when you arrived there, you were all for business. But it was business, and then people wanted more. So we're staying focused on that. And I went back to high altitude training at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. Mark Bone, one of the world's great triathlete coaches, also happens to be a Kiwi, and he's coached a number of Kiwi swimmers, and he actually led the Kiwi team to the Olympics with Brett Naylor. And he was involved in the Olympic Training Center, the U.S. Olympic Training Center, and invited us to train in Colorado. So Anna Simsik and I and a bunch of other Kiwi swimmers went to high altitude training, and we swam at the U.S. Air Force Academy at high altitude and worked out over there. And that was for a couple of weeks. And then we flew back. I think we flew back in early January, and then got ready and serious about the Auckland Commies. It was amazing. Auckland was just absolutely humming then. It was amazing.
Oh, that's great. So in terms of, you've got, so 1990 was just an incredible thing. Did you retire after that, Anthony?
I didn't make a decision to retire until pretty much early 1991. So in 1989, when I graduated from Stanford, I had some job offers and decided to accept a job offer with a management consulting firm who agreed to let me start late. So most students would start, August, September, with their first full-time job after they graduated. And I still had the Commonwealth Games to go, which were January, February. So I asked them if I could start in April. And they said, no, that would be fine. And so I really knew that I was going to take a break from competitive swimming. And, when you win in your hometown and you get to carry the flag, there's something super special about that. And that's one of those moments, again, when you wake up the next morning after you race the win, you go, oh my gosh, I wouldn't want to be anybody else in the flag. It was that level of satisfaction. And that's the kind of satisfaction I thought I wanted to lead the sport on.
And so you made the transition, and then it was quite interesting. So you when did you start flying? You can fly planes, which is remarkable because I kind of said no on that. When did you start the flying, and then your business career has really kind of taken a kind of connection back to your dad and a lot of Air New Zealand and Virgin and things. Yeah. So tell us about when did the flying start, and when did the kind of pivot into all this connection start?
So I haven't flown in many years. I used to have my private pilot's license. I'd have to go back and get it current. But when my dad came back to New Zealand, he decided that he wanted his kids to, get their private pilot's license. So my brother did his, and he went on to be an A330 captain, flying and living in Hong Kong. And so I took mine back then. It was always in the blood. It never quite left me. And so now we fast forward to my management consulting job in Melbourne, Australia. Had originally been in San Francisco, but they closed the San Francisco office and started Melbourne and said, "You're a Kiwi white. Can you help us open a firm because you know Aussies?" And I said, "Well, I'll do it for a wee while." And long story short, I was there like 6 months, and I said, "This is not going to work for me." The woman who's now my wife, we were very close, and I thought I wanted to marry her. And so she was in San Francisco, so I decided to move. I moved back to San Francisco and moved back into management consulting, worked for a wee while. And then I had an illness in the family. My grandmother got very ill. And my father and my grandfather had passed away within 6 months of each other, which meant that my mom had lost her dad and her husband in a brief period of time in 1988.
Oh, wow.
And so my wife and I decided that because my grandmother was getting ill, we were going to take a time out from our work. She worked with management consulting as well, go back to Auckland and spend a few weeks helping my mum out. Well, that turned into 3 years for her and 4 years for me. And while we were back in New Zealand, I joined Flex Challenge in a management program and loved it. Super smart people. But swimming I never lost the love of swimming. So we were living in Devonport in the North Shore. And I decided that I'd figure out if I wanted to be a pilot or not and where aviation was going to take me. So I would drive from Devonport all the way down to Ardmore Airfield, which is south of Auckland. I think you get off at the Tack and then the exit or Manurewa or somewhere. And drive out to the Ardmore Airfield. And I redeveloped my flying love and my skills and developed the hours again just to figure out if this is something I wanted to do. And I remember flying around, the South Auckland area thinking, is this something do I want to do this? Is this a career that I want to do, as a pilot sitting in the seat? And at the same time, I thought, well, let's figure out what aviation jobs are available. So I started speaking to airlines, and I spoke to Singapore Airlines, and I spoke to Air New Zealand. And Air New Zealand said, you know what, Anthony, why don't you come on in and have a chat with us? And so I went in, and Albert Lovell is his name. Albert Lovell ran market development for Air New Zealand at the time. And he said, look, we are really interested in a role for you and I said, well, that's great. And he said, but in what's called event development. And event development was running, triathlons and, all sorts of events on behalf of Air New Zealand with a company logo behind it. And I knew why they wanted to do that, because it was only a couple of years since the Commonwealth Games and my name was still very high profile and I could attract attention, and it made a ton of sense. But I felt like it was trading off my past and not giving me my future. And I remember looking at the organizational chart of his department, and I said, what's this thing here? And he said, commercial alliances manager. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, it's a new role we're developing. And it's really for someone who spent a bunch of time in aviation, who develops alliances with other airlines. And I said, that's me. And so he and a mentor of mine who sadly passed away recently, Tony Mosse, who ran global sales and marketing for Air New Zealand, the two of them got together and said, all right, we'll take a shot at this young man named Mosse. And so I joined Air New Zealand, left lectures, which was really hard to do, and joined Air New Zealand and started in the management side of the business. And did a ton of wonderful things, had a lot of fun. I was the clandestine first relationship with Ansett. At the time, Air New Zealand was owned, a decent chunk of it, by Qantas. So all our Australian conversations went through Qantas, but Tony Mosse would send me to Melbourne, which is where Ansett was headquartered at the time, very quietly, and I would negotiate special deals where, they would buy seats on us, we'd buy seats on them, and it would be the price of their passengers on our flights and vice versa. We started talking about frequent flyer clubs, and all of that was the precursor to Air New Zealand's equity investment in Ansett, which tragically didn't work out well. But thankfully, I wasn't there for that bit. So I was the kind of the initial alliance. I did that. And I was also at the very, very early stages of Star Alliance and Air New Zealand's relationship with United. So I started the first level conversations with United Airlines on behalf of Air New Zealand to pull those communication and coordination together. So that's what alliances did. And I found a love for aviation. And then my wife and I decided that we were both keen on graduate school. So she went back to law school. And I went back to business school. And when I was in business school, I fell in love with finance. And coming out of business school now, a few years later, I thought, well, if I could marry finance with aviation, that would be my future. And so that's how I ended up working in finance and aviation for many years. I advised airlines and investors, equity and debt lenders into aircraft transactions for many years for a U.S. bank. And then after that, I joined Virgin America and had a corporate finance and the treasurer there. And that was a ton of fun, growing an airline, nearly breaking an airline because we grew too fast. Yeah, financially, not mechanically. And then restructuring, and then we took it public, and then we sold it to Alaska for $4 billion a few years ago. So I spent a lot of time. And I think if I look back now and I think about some of the lessons in life, I think if you've got someone who's ambitious, if you've got someone who's got some talent, and if you've got someone who's enthusiastic or really enjoys what they do, those three things really make a ton of difference. And that's kind of when I look back at my life. Swimming was never a glamorous sport, and it's still not a glamorous sport. You go up and down a pool in the early hours of the day, and you don't have a lot of time to converse and chat with people. But look what happened. My life kind of opened up because I was a good swimmer, and one thing led to another. So, I think, again, if you're relatively ambitious, you have a hint of a talent, and you talked about my ankles beforehand. Maybe they were part of my talent. Maybe my mental approach was as well. But I fundamentally love what I did. And it kind of brings it all around to aviation and swimming. When you love what you do, you don't see things in terms of sacrifices. You see things in terms of benefits. And my very simple example I give people is my alarm used to go off at, 5:30 in the morning. And I get two choices, right? The alarm goes off and there's one side of the bed and the other side of the bed. And the negative side of the bed says, oh, it's cold outside, it's dark, I'm hungry, my body aches from practice, it's warm in bed, and this is really hard to get out. And the other side of the bed, the alarm goes off and I say, okay, well, I'm going to spend time with people I enjoy spending time with. I'm going to put my body in good shape. I'm trying to make a national team. I might actually even learn something. If I'm in an outdoor pool, I might see the sun come up. It's all very simplistic, but I think that makes a massive difference. And if you can find athletes, kids, adults who see things in terms of the benefit side of the ledger and not the sacrifices side, I think they're always going to be the ones who I would bet on to succeed more. So that's that kind of enjoyment, enthusiasm. You have to have talent, and you have to have ambition. But those three things together, I think, when I look at what I've been able to do in my life, aviation is not particularly glamorous or fancy. It might have been 50 years ago when my parents were in it, but now it's transport. And swimming is never particularly glamorous, but things have opened up because I maybe had a bit of each of those three. And, if I can partake, or at least if I can share with others of what I've been able to enjoy, those are the kind of themes that I think make a difference.
That's fantastic. So really positivity, right? Glass half full. So what you've taken through really your whole life. And I think what I kind of took out the Air New Zealand story was, you never rested on your laurels. You kind of say, oh, opportunity, that excites me. But is that kind of how you're viewing your decision?
I think people said, well, why are you leaving Fletcher's, which was and still is a phenomenal company, and you're with some incredible other young managers. Why would you leave something like that? And it just wasn't for me. I really enjoyed it. I admired how incredibly smart everybody was, but you just have to chase your own passion. I remember the head of the group saying, look, Anthony, are you sure you want to do this? Because I had hoped that one day you would be sitting in my chair. That's what he said. And I was flattered by that and had to think really hard about it, but I wanted to follow my passion. And it would be a wee bit like me, getting on a rugby team and, we might have won a game. And but knowing that I was good at swimming and deciding that rugby was more glamorous, and I should focus on that rather than focusing on what I thought I was going to be good at, which might not have been glamorous, but worked out okay in the end. It's aviation became a little bit of my swimming, if you will. And I worked really hard at it, and I thoroughly enjoyed what I did. And now the approach to relationships that I learned in my commercial career. When I worked at Fletcher's, I had an offshore international job, and with Air New Zealand developing alliances for relationship, kind of relationship management, business development. And then in my banking days, it was building relationships. And then with Virgin America, it was building relationships and having people invest in the company, because prior to me joining, we were really struggling, and I wasn't the reason necessarily why we did well. I was right time, right place, right person. But people would not give credit to the company, so we couldn't get airplanes. And without airplanes, you can't grow. And so it was all about relationship development and network management and developing rapport and telling somebody you were going to go and do something, then going and doing it and telling them what you did. And that credibility was massively important. And if I kind of go even higher, it's all about representing the entity that you've got to represent. And I look back now at my career, and I spent nearly 10 years at Virgin. Virgin's one of the world's great brands, but we were never one of the biggest airlines. And we won all sorts of awards. And I think a lot of the large airlines were jealous of us because we did really well. And our customers, our teammates loved us. Our guests loved us. And I feel like a little bit like New Zealand. New Zealand's not massive, but we have an extraordinary brand. And people love us. So we're never going to be as large as some of the other nations doing some of the things they do, but we can be really good at what we do. And so I get great joy now in my life because my role as Honorary Consul for New Zealand, I sit in a really interesting space, and also my consulting with the New Zealand government, I sit in a really interesting space between the movement of people and capital between the US and New Zealand. And I get to put those together. And when I represented Virgin America and raised capital and did what we did to go public and competed against the big guys, I feel like I'm doing something similar with New Zealand, where I get to represent New Zealand offshore again. And look for smart, talented people who can contribute to New Zealand's economy and the diversity that New Zealand offers and the beauty and the scenery and all that sort of stuff. So it's about, taking responsibility and doing the best you can for the entity that you're representing. And for me, that consistently has been New Zealand. I've represented New Zealand, athletically, we just talked about, commercially, for Fletcher's in New Zealand, and diplomatically in my honorary consul and some of the other stuff I'm doing. But a lot of it comes back to the country that I represent, which I'm supremely proud of. And I couldn't have a better place to represent where I am in the United States right now. You live in Silicon Valley and you see all this wonderful technology, and New Zealand's doing some phenomenal things. So it's an exciting time as we reemerge from COVID, and we start to see New Zealand and the US start doing wonderful things together again. I'm super excited about the future.
I'm interested. I'm kind of in the same boat as you. I have American citizen, American wife, and and many of us live between kind of two countries. How have you balanced that? I mean, I think that's kind of a thing. In a great world, we could kind of live between two. How have you kind of managed that? And when you went back to America, did you have kids at this stage, or how have you kind of lived between two worlds?
I think I've been able to live between two worlds because I'm an independent person by nature, and I'm happy. Home is where my heart is, or my hat is, or however they say. So I'm comfortable. I was sent away to boarding school at a young age. Family in Hong Kong. Put on a 10.5-hour flight in the middle seat of a DC-10 from Hong Kong to Auckland, and you're on your own for months at a time before you turn around and see your family again. So you do that for 2 or 3 years, and you become quite independent. So I was always happy to be here, but New Zealand was always home. I carry 2 passports, but New Zealand will be the passport I will always keep if I have to only keep one. And I've represented New Zealand in so many different ways. So might be the first thing I think of in the morning. It might be the last thing I think about, but I don't necessarily live there. Now, as I transition into a different part of my life, pre-COVID, I was traveling to New Zealand, 3, 4, 5 times a year. And it became very easy. San Francisco, Auckland is an extraordinarily great service that Air New Zealand used to put on, and hopefully they'll do it again. And it's very, very easy to do that. And so my wife and I came down to Auckland. I've spent now a total of a month in MIQ in the last year, because I've had 2 trips back. And we came down in December, almost exactly a year ago. We came out of MIQ, I think, on the 21st of December last year. And we spent 3.5 months in New Zealand to figure out how we could manage living in New Zealand and working in New Zealand while having obligations in both New Zealand and the US. And that worked out really well, actually. So by the time we got back here, because we can do most things by, web, by Zoom, it was actually pretty easy to manage that. And I think we are now empty nesters. Both our kids have now gone off to college. We've got much more flexibility to do what it is we want to do. So I think there'll be more of that once New Zealand opens up again and we can start traveling. But it's easy. It's easy for me to live those 2 lives in the US when New Zealand means so much to me. It might be more different if I was living in New Zealand, because the US might mean relatively less to me. Although, my kids, if we ever did that, my kids would probably be in the US. But, we'll figure that one out. But I think when you represent a country and you live overseas, that country's still never far from you, even if geographically, you're not in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head for many New Zealanders in the States. They kind of sit there with their New Zealand news apps. And actually, I remember, you're talking to some Kiwi back home and you're like, oh, this is happening. I don't know. You're like following the news more closely than them, or the cricket score. And it's funny. Yeah,
that's another way to answer the question too. Is you're right? I'm probably more on top of the Kiwi news now because it's so easy to get. Than I am. And, if I'm in the US, I'm looking for the change in the news cycle early, because, if I get up at 6 or 7 in the morning, the news cycle quite hasn't. I looked at the news cycle before I went to bed, And it quite hasn't changed because New Zealand's still going overnight. And then, later on in the morning, it'll change and I'll be watching what's going on. So trying to stay involved with that. But I also say that, my consul role with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade keeps me in touch. I'm in contact with the Consul-General's office in Los Angeles quite often. And, I'm getting news of what's happening in New Zealand. And I'm still representing New Zealand, just in a different capacity.
Yeah. How did you how did that role come about, Anthony?
Oh, they just really tapped me 8 or 9 years ago and said, "Is this something you might be interested in?" And
fantastic.
I had a wild and crazy Virgin America role at the time, and it was tough to juggle. But now that I have more time, I can dedicate more time to it. And so, it's been extraordinary. It really has. But what's really cool is seeing also the commercial side of this, that New Zealand companies, I spend a lot of time in finance, a lot of time in strategy, and a lot of time in brand, Richard Branson's Virgin America brand. And so those things are frequently things that, Kiwi companies are interested in assisting with or having assistance with, and are looking for network. So being able to contribute to that over here has meant an awful lot. And it's really come as a function of my work with and on behalf of the government. I will say that the Consul-General, the Honorary Consul, is honorary. So it's purely voluntary. And you do what you love because you love to represent New Zealand. And that can mean, that, hopefully it doesn't happen, but it does happen from time to time. If a Kiwi gets in trouble, has an accident, just making sure that the government knows and the family knows and there are plans in place to help, right through to, New Zealand, no surprise, has become a very attractive country in the last 18 months for people to move to. And so a whole ton of Kiwis would like to have their partners come in with partnership visas to arrive in New Zealand with them. So, certifying documents and doing that kind of stuff is one of the highlights for me, to see the smiles on the faces, because typically they've done all this work, months to get all this paperwork together. Got a Kiwi person and their partner is an American, and they're meeting with me and they've got all the documents. They want me to certify, and then I'm going to put this in an envelope and send it off. And it's a really happy moment, because other than the border being closed, it signifies that they're going to move back to New Zealand. So it's staying involved with New Zealand in a variety of different opportunities, both personal and commercial, that get me excited to continue to help out going forward.
Yeah, it's fantastic. There's a couple of things I wanted to cover that, I think they're an important part of your story. You're a commentator for quite a while for New Zealand TVNZ, and there was a swimmer that you'll know well, Daniel Loader, and actually when I look on the clips, I go, oh, here's Anthony's voice. So, those were iconic moments. And also he swam in your race in the 200 butterfly, I think. With the one before 92, right? 92. Is he got a silver. Yeah. So tell us about, that must have been fantastic for you, someone to kind of pass the torch to and being there. And, I suppose we're at home watching this, but you're kind of like on live and this can be recorded forever. Just tell us about those experiences, watching him and also probably also commentating that fantastic double gold moment.
Well, being a commentator is, I've got to tell you, one of the most exciting and fulfilling and rewarding things that came out of my swimming career. I was asked to do the 1994 Vancouver Commonwealths, and that was my first time with the legendary Keith Quinn. And so Quinny was kind of the anchor expert, and I was the color commentator. And I learned a lot from him. And then after that, John Macbeth and I commentated many Commonwealth Games and Olympics, and he's become a great friend of mine. And we've had a ton of fun together. So the 92 Olympics, when Daniel won silver, was probably the only time in my life where I really wasn't that interested in swimming. I kind of retired in 91 after the 1990 Commonwealths, and I was really involved in building my career. And I knew that he'd done very well. I didn't commentate those, but he did win the silver. And obviously that, was a precursor to what he was going to do in 1996. And so, yes, John Macbeth and I commentated in 96 when Danny won. He won his 200 first. And I remember watching him, as one would do. As a commentator, you don't just call the races. You sit there beforehand and you watch the athletes warm up and you kind of see their body language. And, that's something that I prided myself on, was understanding how the athletes looked and trying to predict how well they would do. And he just looked really, really, really good. And he'd had a great meet, I think, in Santa Clara in the US beforehand. He'd done really well against most of the same competition. I just felt like this was it. And so, New Zealand hadn't had a true Olympic champion, which shared an Olympic champion with Malcolm Champion, happened to be his last name, who swam in the 4x2 freestyle relay for Australasia in 1912. So this, 84 years later. But this was the true first. And I'd known how difficult it was to get to gold, not achieving that. And Paul Kingsman had done the same. Jean Hurring had hers bronze medal as well. But we were still looking for the gold. And I remember telling John Macbeth, I think Daniel looks really good. The race went beautifully well for him. And I just remember he turned at 150 with less than 50 to go. And you can tell, at least I could tell, I've watched enough races when you think someone's going to catch up to somebody and they're not going to. And there was just no way they were going to catch him. His body position was high. His leg drive, he created this beautiful leg drive. He had a great kick. And I remember standing up and screaming. And John and I would agree that I would say something to a certain point, and he'd say something to a certain point. And he tells this wonderful story. And by the way, John's got a book coming out next year. So hopefully I'm not going to steal his thunder, but he talks about, how I got so excited about that, how our understanding didn't quite hold to what we'd agreed to. And I kept chatting away and shouting. And I stood up, and apparently my headphone cord nearly came out of the socket, in which case you wouldn't have heard me say anything. And he had to hold it in. And then, the rest was history. And so after the 200, John and I were absolutely knackered. I think we couldn't quite believe that New Zealand won gold. And we kind of sat down, and we had all these TV commentators coming up to us from all these other countries saying, congratulations. It felt like we'd won. That was absolutely a highlight for me. And then, of course, 3 days later, he won the 400 as well. A super moment for New Zealand, but an incredible moment for New Zealand swimming. And being a commentator, being able to call that kind of stuff, it's, as a commentator, if you do that full time, you live for that moment. You live for the chance to be able to call that thing, that kind of one Olympic gold medal. And I know that Keith Quinn and John Macbeth have this lovely banter because Quinny never called an Olympic gold medal in swimming. Macbeth got to do it. And so I love the banter that those two guys have. And I'm thankful to Daniel to create the memory.
I think you said he's going to do it. And so you were really, but it was kind of perfect because it was that enthusiasm and I think it was perfect, both of you in there. So it's just an iconic New Zealand moment. And there's another thing you mentioned Santa Clara. There was a kind of big thing we didn't cover with your story about the underwater kick story. Can you tell me about that? That was kind of a big issue at the time.
So 1988 pre-Olympics, there was a number of international competitions, and I'd probably fair to say that I was one of the fastest kickers in the world. I just the way my body was built, I was very, very very quick at kicking. In training and practice, I would do a lot of kick sets that were faster than a number of people used to swim. This was before the rules were set, especially in backstroke, where you could swim the entire length of the pool underneath the water, and then pop up and turn, and swim underneath the water. And swim really meant kick. And so if you can imagine a backstroker starting and they dive back and they go underneath the water and they do the butterfly kick on their back. And this is what all the backstrokers were developing at that time in 1988, was this underwater kick to go as far as possible, because you're like a submarine. You're actually faster than if you sit on top of the surface. So in 1988 at the Santa Clara International Swim Complex, which was typically the one of the pre-Olympic meets for everybody, or a lot of the international teams would come through on their way to the Olympic Games, I went and swam. And my coach and I had a conversation, and we decided that I was going to swim butterfly on my back. And so the 100-meter butterfly, the final 100 butterfly, and the starter says, "Gentlemen, take your marks." And I bend over, and the gun goes off, and I dive in, and I immediately rotate onto my back. And so I'm about 3 feet underneath the surface, and I'm doing the butterfly kick on my back, and I'm racing away from the rest of the field. So you can see these butterflies looking at me, and I'm kicking away like this, and I must have gone 40 meters underneath the water, popped up a couple of strokes, took a breath, underneath again, kicked maybe another 20 meters, and then finished, say, the last 25-ish, and did really, really well. And everyone else had just done all the swimming. So I'd probably gone, 40 plus, 20-ish, 60, 65 meters underneath the water, really, really quick. And all of a sudden, there's this call over the meet announcer over the PA system. Oh, well, Anthony Mosse and coach, please meet the meet referee.
Oh, no.
So we go and have a chat with the meet referee, and the meet referee says, look, I don't know what you did, because I can't see anywhere here where it says you can't do what you did, but you'll never, ever do that in my meet again. And what a massive mistake. When I look back now, if I'd continued to do that, they couldn't have disqualified me at the Olympics, because they couldn't disqualify me in Santa Clara. So had I dived in, rotated on my back, and done the underwater kick, I would have been outwardly faster than I was on the surface, because my kick was so quick. It might have changed the course of the 100 butterfly at the Olympics.
Oh, fantastic! And you have a bit of an illustrious master's career as well. So you kept up with it. Or was it just when do you suddenly I'll go get back into what how have you done your master's career? Because you're the masters, you've been the masters US champions a few times as well.
Yes, it really comes and goes. It's really a function of what else in my life is keeping me busy. And we sold Virgin America to Alaska just before the World Masters Games were held in Auckland. And so it gave me a couple or 3 months to get in shape. So that's all I did for 3 months, is with all the spare time, I got back in shape again. And I had a ton of fun. And, Auckland did an incredible job of hosting such a massive competition, and it worked out really well. And it was a great excuse. I think for me, it's an excuse or a reason to get in shape. A lot of my master stuff these days are around teams and relays. And I kind of joke that if I'm going to do a master's race for myself and the alarm goes off at whatever time, 5 o'clock in the morning, if I don't get up, nobody knows it's going to be. But if you and Xavier and Anthony are on a relay team,
that's right. You get a phone call.
I'm going to get a phone call from you. It's the motivation that no longer is within. It's the motivation from without, if you will.
So do some little quick fire. What's your favorite book and movie, or even song? Any favorites?
Way of the Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman.
Good book, yes.
I really, really enjoyed that one. I was going through a tough time with my dad. I've read that a number of times. I'm a massive Bond fan, so I love the Bond movies.
Okay.
I just kind of like action and excitement. My family will tell you, which is really interesting, I don't like tight spaces, so elevators are not my friends, but I love submarine warfare. I read a ton of Tom Clancy and that kind of stuff. So submarine kind of geopolitical, that kind of stuff I really do enjoy as well. Bucket list, I'd love to make a cold chisel concert one of these days. I've been a cold chisel fan for 35 or 40 years. It's a good mate of mine, Grant Forbes, who was a Kiwi swimmer, introduced me to them. Actually, I think he introduced me to them when I had my broken ankle, and we were roommates before the 1982 Commonwealth Games training in Hamilton. And I followed Jimmy Barnes and cold chisel for years, and thought I'd love to go and see a concert. So music-wise, I'd love to see cold chisel live.
Oh yeah, so we'll do a shout out for anybody who's got access to cold chisel. Anthony would like some tickets, and Gal as well. So hopefully that can make it happen. So we'll just end on some advice. What sort of advice would you have for New Zealanders going to America, or to try to look at their dream? Or maybe there are New Zealanders listening to this podcast that are based in America. What sort of advice would you give them for sort of pursuing their dreams and goals?
I think it's kind of simple, and maybe a theme that we've talked through a wee bit, which is to find something you love and work longer and harder at it than anybody else. Because when you love what you do, you don't see things in terms of, again, I said it sacrifices, you see things in terms of benefits. And you enjoy the discipline. You enjoy the structure. You enjoy what other people would call hard work. And I think that makes all the difference. And I don't care, I don't mind if it's a swimmer or, a soccer player or a musician or an artist or, a street sweeper. I don't care what it is. It's just if you can really find what you love to do and be better than anybody else at it because you're going to work harder at it, that's where I think satisfaction comes. And it's less about how well you do compared to others, which I've learned to understand from my Olympic experience, and more how you do compared to yourself. You might win a race by a ton, and on the surface, everyone says, "Oh my gosh, that's great," and get all the media attention, but it's slower than your best time, and you weren't happy. And you might not win a race and have people ignore you, but you did your best time. So I talk about how it's really more about you and less about where you finish compared to others. But fundamentally, it's finding something that you love and dedicating your time to it, because good things happen.
Yeah, that's gold, Anthony. Thanks for that. So you've had such a remarkable career, diverse career, really, as well. What next for Anthony Mosse? And Gal, I must have put there as well. But what's next on your guys' bucket list? Or what are your plans for the future?
Well, so right now I am advising companies, investing in companies. I chair a couple of companies, and I think some board work. I'll do some more board work going forward. When I retired from swimming, I gave back to the extent I could with respect to swimming clinics and coaching clinics and motivational speeches and all that sort of stuff. And it was a chance for me back then to give back to the sport that I loved. And now that I haven't retired, but now I've got more opportunities to do what it is I want. I think kind of advice, networking, and really just helping the general, NZ Inc. out, I think is more and more in my future. So that's what I'm looking forward to. I'm also looking forward to getting back in the pool. My 3 herniated discs have been bothering me now for about a year, and getting on top of those, I think I'm starting to get on top of that now. So getting back in shape, I think, is really important. So I'm looking forward to doing that in 2022. And my wife and I, now empty nesters. So, what it is we want to do going forward to have the kids at home. So travel, I think more frequent trips back to New Zealand. And really building that bridge again between New Zealand and the US as we all come out of COVID, I think is a big goal. I think it's probably a goal that New Zealand has, is to develop those relationships again with the US. And it's certainly a personal goal of mine to try and make that happen and help however I can.
Fantastic, Anthony. That's awesome. So our podcast is called Kiwi Leaders, or we call Kiwi Leadership Network. But what does the words Kiwi Leaders mean to you?
Well, it means Kiwis helping out other Kiwis. And it may not be necessarily an obvious leader, but it's someone who can help out somebody else. And if somebody else is a Kiwi, then I'm all for it. And it could be both ways, right? It could be in New Zealand or it could be in the US. So look, I think it's wonderful what you're doing. You're kind of making something out of nothing. I think there's this idea that New Zealand and the US can be close, and that we can help out the two countries, but it takes someone to build that bridge, and you're building that bridge with the Leadership Network and with the people that you've already spoken to, and with the stuff that I'm reading and seeing. I think you're the definition of it. So sometimes it just takes doers. And it's not obvious that, just because it might be someone who's famous or who's done well and successful in certain areas can be a leader. It's people who are willing to get in and spend the time to do what they need to do to help out. And that could be the government, that could be private sector. I know we've got a great group called SF Kiwis, for example. I went to a holiday party last week. They are Kiwi, they're part of the Kiwi Leadership in my mind. If the New Zealand arrives, the US needs help, and somebody can help them out. That's the leadership for me. So it's doing something helpful for Kiwi and myself.
So, thanks for coming on our podcast. Where can people find you or follow you?
Through my LinkedIn profile, probably the easiest, and also through the New Zealand Consulate as well. If anybody needs any help or advice or guidance, I'm always here. So I'm happy to help.
Oh, that's fantastic, Anthony. This is it's been an incredible journey. I think those who got through the whole thing, I think it was worthwhile going through it, because I think every little bit, you can't tell a story simply. And I think there was a lot of complexity in there and backstory. And I think it's just good to get that whole thing in there. And I just wanted to really thank you immensely for everything you've done for New Zealand with swimming and business, and everything you've given back and you continue to give back. And we wish you all the best. Thank you so much for coming on podcast, Anthony.
My pleasure, Xavier. It's been awesome. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and really appreciate all that you're doing. Thank you so much.
If you like that episode, subscribe to us and follow us on YouTube. Who should we have on next? Send me an email, and thanks again for listening. Thank you.